and sit down at the table with love.
And the last time we were talking about an ancient Jewish wedding ceremony and the significance that has for our life as Christians. To see this pattern that our Jewish bridegroom Jesus is going to follow, how we have already been betrothed, and that in the future we're going to go to that wedding chuppah with him. And it's just so important when we see that picture and what we have to look forward to. In fact, sometimes when I tell that story, I've had a couple people say that when they heard that, they felt born again. There's just something that you witness to in your spirit that, of course, he would be this romantic bridegroom that would abduct his bride in such a romantic ceremony. It's just so fitting for who he is. But today I want to share with you what I learned at our son's wedding, who he and his wife, Rebecca, were married in 1996, and they came to us and said that they wanted to have a Jewish wedding ceremony. And it really had nothing to do with John and I. I mean, I'm capable of being manipulative and suggesting that because I had seen the meaning, at least in an ancient Jewish wedding. But we really had nothing to do with it. Rebecca at the time worked at she went to Bible college. She worked there too, but she went to a Bible college up in Estes Park called Ravenscrest. And one of her professors was a Messianic Jew. And he was telling her about wedding ceremonies, the Jewish wedding ceremony and the significance. And Rebecca thought it was so beautiful, and she talked to Ben about it, and she said, let's have a Jewish wedding, and he agreed. And so Rebecca and I and Ben just started looking into in Jewish books about what a Jewish wedding was. And some of the things we discovered and the things that they did at their wedding opened my eyes to see even further revelation into some things in the Word. And I'll share with you. Let me just tell the story, and then I'll tell you what I saw. So what we found out, and this is amazing to me, is this is part of where I started discovering just how important baptism is. I mean, I'd had an encounter with baptism myself and got delivered through baptism, and I'll tell that story later, not this time, but during another session. But I knew there was a lot more to baptism than we learned when I was a new believer. I was told, just be baptized because the Word says we should be. And it really didn't mean much to me. I was doing it in obedience and, as a new Christian. But in Jewish weddings, the bride and groom, the night before their wedding, they have a baptism. The word is mikvah, and our baptism, I think the Greek word is baptismo, actually comes from Jewish baptisms, mikvah. They're called mikvahs, and they didn't just start, baptisms didn't start with John the Baptist in the New Testament. The idea of mikvahs or baptisms, it actually means immersing yourself, started, back when Moses was given the Torah on Mount Sinai. It was part of their purity laws to cleanse themselves. And in fact, if you look closely, and I can't go into that now, I'm capable of going off on 19, there was a baptism. They washed themselves and then consecrated themselves for 3 days. So the bride Israel, when he took them to that mountain for marriage, there was a mikvah that they partook of. So mikvahs have always been part of, before a wedding, a bride and groom would be cleansed and be baptized in a mikvah. And there were lots of reasons, for baptisms, but they were for purity. So if you touched a dead body, you always have to separate life and death. It's separating the holy from the profane, the sacred from the common. There was just a part of doing that was cleansing yourself, immersing yourself in water, and separating yourself from the thing that was unclean. Priests would go in a mikvah before they went in for temple services. The high priest on Yom Kippur did several mikvahs that day before he went into the Holy of Holies. And but another main reason for a mikvah is on after a woman's menstrual cycle. And so mikvahs were very important for purity In Israel, in ancient Israel, they excavated several mikvahs under the temple area, and like 500 mikvahs or something they found under the temple. And what they are is there's steps going down into a pool. They're very private. Nobody can see. You have to go down into them. But there's running water. There has to be living water. It has to flow in and flow out, and that makes a mikvah. And the person being immersed actually immerses themselves. They go down into the water, and there's a witness that stands there to witness the fact that, yes, they went under the water, they're pure, and they're declared pure. They go in without clothes on. They go in totally cleansed before they even go in. So it isn't to clean the outside of their bodies. It's to clean their spirit, to separate them from anything defiling. Well, on the 14th day of a menstrual cycle, a woman would go in because if an egg doesn't get fertilized, it's death. There's death that gets sloughed off. And so she would go into a mikveh on the 14th day and separate death from life and be ready to receive life again. In fact, the 14th day is when she is the most fertile. And at the end of this session, I'm going to have John share with you a revelation he had about David and Bathsheba, and that there was a mikveh involved in their sin. And I want him to share it because it's really good. But anyway, it's a 14th day of their cycle. So a man and wife are separated those 14 days until she's clean again. And when they come together, the likelihood of conception is really high. Jewish people see it as every month they get to have a honeymoon because the separation, creates the longing to come together in a new way. So, but anyway, another main reason for a mikveh or immersion would be the night before their wedding. And I love that God made provision for a man and woman to come together on their wedding day without any baggage. And so what they do is each one separately goes to the mikveh. In Ben and Rebecca's case, we had a hot tub, and we used our hot tub for more baptisms than anything else. It was very convenient. At their wedding, they had two people officiating. It was the Jewish man that was Rebecca's teacher, and then our friend Tim Ruthven, who was learning about Jewish roots and loved the idea and loved Ben, knew him since he was little. And so Tim and Wayne, this other man, the Jew and Gentile, under their bridal chuppah, was very significant. So Tim's wife, Marge, went out to our deck where our hot tub was, and Rebecca would have written on a piece of paper any person that she'd ever given her heart to in any way, emotionally. It didn't have to be physically, even emotions given away. People that she'd had affections for, crushes on, boyfriends, any emotional place in her heart where she'd given herself away at all. And of course, even physically, if she had any kind of sexual experiences with a man before Ben, they would be on that paper too. She went out, and Marge was the witness, and before God, she spent some time between her and God. Just he knew the list, she knew the list. And basically what she was doing is when she immersed herself in the water, she was cutting herself off from any of those ties, any of the soul ties, any of the attachments, anything that made her unclean or had connected her to another person in any way. And when she came up out of the waters, she was declared clean and pure. And Jews see it as like, you're as pure as the day you were born. It's like born again after this mikveh to be given to your husband. And then Ben went out with Tim and did the same thing, with his piece of paper, any place he'd given himself away. So they were both cleansed. They were both newly born again, ready to, with no baggage, ready to be united together the next day. Well, right after the baptism, usually the bride and groom will fast. And so this was in the evening when the baptism took place. And then their wedding was also in the evening. So they fasted that next day because the idea is right after you're married, the first moments, once you're pronounced man and wife, there's a room. In this case, it was at the Marriott Hotel, and we had the ceremony and the chuppah set up in the hotel, and Ben and Rebecca had a room there where they spent the night. But right after the ceremony, they would break the fast, go into this room together where, in their case, they usually have a small meal, and in this case, it was Omi, Ben's grandmother, made her famous chicken soup, and Ben and Rebecca had their first half hour of marriage, not having to talk to anybody else, but just being together, breaking their fast, and those first moments as a married couple together. Well, of course, that time after the ceremony in ancient Israel would be the time when they went into the bridal chuppah for 7 days. But in modern weddings, both ceremonies take place under the chuppah, and the reception takes place right after this time of seclusion. But it's interesting because it represents that time that in ancient Israel they were secluded for 7 days, and the consummation would have taken place. So anyway, that's the idea of the mikvah. It broke off any attachments to any other person, and I think that's such a beautiful thing. Baptism is such a provision, even for new believers, of breaking off all those things you gave yourself to, in the world, and it disarms the principalities and powers that are attached to you, what you gave yourself to in the world, so you can start new. It's the same at a wedding, and I love that God makes provision for that. So, okay, the next day, the ceremony is done under the chuppah, and like I said, in ancient Israel, the betrothal was in the bride's house, but the consummation is in the groom's house. And just a side note, you can see that Jesus came to earth in the bride's house, did the betrothal, but he's taking us someplace in the clouds to his Father's, something of heavenly chuppah, with the Father and the Father's house in the future. So I love that too. But anyway, today in modern Judaism, years ago, during persecutions that were happening in Europe or Russia or really all over, they decided it was best to have both ceremonies under the chuppah, because sometimes they do a betrothal and then the persecution started and they got separated, or one of them died and they were still legally betrothed to this other person. So they decided they put both ceremonies under the chuppah, first the betrothal, then the consummation. The ketubah was there, the contract, which was a very beautiful thing that Ben and Rebecca had made up, and that was signed by them and witnesses, their promise to care and love for each other and how they were going to do that. The first part of the ceremony, the betrothal, they took the cup of betrothal, and then the veil is put down. Well, wait, let me go back. So walking up the aisle, how they come to the chuppah represents a man's household. And so we walked him up to the chuppah, his household, and he stood under the chuppah waiting for Rebecca. Her parents walked her in, and she circled the chuppah 7 times to cut off, of course she wasn't ending her relationship with her parents, but she was cutting herself off from being part of their household, because now she was going to join Ben's, and she and Ben were going to form a household together. So after circling the chuppah with her parents, then Ben stretched out his hand and then took her into his household. And then under the chuppah is where both ceremonies took place. And then John and I and Rebecca's parents were on the 4 poles of the chuppah as witnesses. There's always witnesses at anything Jewish, to remind the person being baptized, to remind the person being married, whatever it is the ceremony is, to remind them that we were there and we were witnesses, that this was legal and it was good and that God was there. Then, so the betrothal ceremony, they take a cup of wine, and Ben gives her the cup of wine, and then the veil's put back down. But in the second part, the consummation, they take the cup of consummation, the second cup of wine, and then the veil stays up. Then the blessings, 7 blessings of a wedding are said over them, and they're very beautiful. And then, like I said, they went into a room before their guests, before they ever talked to any of their guests, broke their fast, had this meal together, and then came out of this room, and the groomsmen, or the friend of the bridegroom in ancient Israel, but the best man today, it would be called, Ben's best man, stood at the door looking for them to come down the hallway, and when he saw them coming, he opened the doors and announced their arrival. And it would have been like in ancient Israel when the friend of the bridegroom would announce the wedding after 7 days had been consummated, and now the party can begin. So they come into joyous music and everybody clapping and saying Mazel Tov, and the party begins. The food, the party, the music begins. Well, there's a ceremony where I looked back years later and I saw a picture and I finally understood what it meant. I thought it was beautiful at the time when Ben and Rebecca were doing it, but I didn't really get it then. Now I do. And what it was is that at a wedding, when the music starts, the bride and groom are put on chairs. They each are put on a chair, and then the people at the wedding ceremony lift up the chairs, and then they dance around with the bride and groom on these chairs to the music. It's called the Nisuin, and it comes from the Hebrew word nasa. And oh, wait till I tell you what that means. And I can't talk about it till the fall feast class, but you're just going to love the places this is in the scripture. I'm telling you, there is a picture that is undeniably, it's so good. Anyway, I can't do it now because it'll be another hour if I start that. But it's called the Nisuim. It means the carrying away, the lifting up of the bride. Okay, I have to read this to consider this word. In 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, it says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout." Remember, the bridegroom, all of a sudden there's, "Behold, the bridegroom cometh with a voice of an archangel and with the trumpet of God." It's called the last trump. Fall feast. I'm not going to talk about it now. "And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord." They are caught up. Nisuim. There's a day coming when, just like Ben and Rebecca, they were on chairs. They weren't on the ground. They weren't on earth, but they weren't in heaven. They were somewhere in between. And they were caught away. Nisuim, the catching away of the bride. The catching away, because the Lord is going to meet us in the air. Not in heaven, not on earth, somewhere in between. Oh, I'm saying too much, but you'll find out in the fall feast that he's coming with clouds. And just like Moses went up and the cloud came down. Same picture. Oh, I can't talk about that now. Another fall feast verse, but it's so perfect. It's so many places in Scripture. You're going to love it. But it means the catching away, the carrying away. It's actually a word for marriage, a catching away of the marriage, of a bride for marriage. And, I can't resist. In Matthew 24, where it says, in that day, Jesus says that there'll be people grinding, and some will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken and one will be left. That word taken there is a Greek word, palamberno. I don't know. I'll have to look it up. I'll talk about it in another session. But anyway, it's a Greek word that means taken for marriage. So there's a catching up of the bride coming, and it's exciting. So anyway, the Nisuim, when I saw that at their wedding, I thought back on it years later when I was looking at this verse in 1 Thessalonians, when God was teaching me with the Nisuim, the catching up of the bride, from that word nasa. And I'm going to go into a long teaching on it at a later time, but I just wanted to share that. There's a future wedding coming. And even modern day ancient Israel weddings, modern day Jewish weddings, they still carry the pattern of how Jesus is going to come. They have clues into that glorious day when his wedding is going to take place. It's a glimpse into a future wedding, our wedding. And we can be excited. We have so much to look forward to. When you see it, when you understand it, as I walk you through scriptures, as I walk you through these feasts, through the ceremonies, you will be undone and realize that we have nothing to fear. We have everything to be excited about. He has planned, God has planned, the Father God has planned this wedding for his Son for 6,000 years. It's the passion on his heart. It's the passion that motivates the bridegroom. It's the passion that we saw all through the Old Testament. Once Israel was married on that mountain, there was a passion of a bridegroom that came out. And I'm going to show you that when we talk about Shavuot. But he's passionate. He's waited 6,000 years for this. He has waited for this wedding day, the day of the gladdening of his heart. It is the only thing that makes the Bible make sense. And I thought about Bill Johnson. He's a pastor in Redding, California, and he said something that I really believe is true. He said, one of the greatest tragedies of life is when the Bible is interpreted by those who are not in love. We have to be in love. The Bible makes sense, only makes sense if we're in love. It's a romantic story. There's a divine romance there. He lost a bride. He lost a place to dwell with her. The whole plan of redemption. The ancient Jewish wedding ceremony. Modern Jewish wedding ceremonies are about that plan, are about that wedding that's to come, that he's looking forward to, and we are too. He wants a bride that when he sees us coming that day, when we're caught up, we know each other, that we're excited to see each other. He can't wait for that day. So, it's good. So, bless you all.
Well, Christie wanted me to share with you, at least an abbreviated version, of some of what I felt I got one day in reading 2 Samuel 11 about David and Bathsheba. I was just kind of curious what the message was here, if it wasn't just the obvious that David had no business having an adulterous relationship. But what if there was something more here? So the short version is this. Chrissy already addressed how the Jewish people would do mikvahs without any clothes on. Men and women would do them separately. What if Bathsheba wasn't sunbathing? That's kind of a modern cultural thing. And she was not wearing any clothes. So there's a chance she was in a mikveh. In a time when she was giving herself to the Lord that wasn't meant to be observed by other people. And somehow, let us say, in those ancient settings, there was some kind of perspective from David's veranda, whatever, that he could see into the local mikveh. Now, the Hebrew word there for bathing is not just taking a bath. It's the same word used in Isaiah 4 for the Lord cleansing the people. So it's not just a washing. It's a washing unto something. Because right after this, Bathsheba conceived. So there's an indication of the timing that this all took place. So again, if I'm not reading too much into this, the principle that I got from this is that when a person in authority takes advantage of another individual's vulnerability before the Lord, they've entered into the same sin that David did with Bathsheba. And that really struck me. It really says something about how we interact with one another and how we don't use the presence of God or people's tenderness or vulnerability to get them to do what we want them to do. Whether it's a personal thing, whether it's some kind of a church project, whatever it might be. It's so amazing to think that the Lord has called us to build one another up, to encourage one another, that he's taking lively stones and fitting them together and building his house, that we don't have to use each other, that we can not even fear being used as we make our hearts vulnerable before the Lord. So there you go. There's my version of David and Bathsheba.